Hello, everyone. This is Joel Hellman. I'm Dean of the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown University, and I want to welcome you to another one of our fast break communications with our SFS alumni around the world. Time for lunchtime here on the East Coast, but I'm sure it's dinner time or breakfast time in many other parts of the world, but I'm so glad you can join us. I'm thrilled to have here at this extraordinary moment in Korea and U.S.-Korean relations. I'm thrilled to have Victor Cha, distinguished university professor, the highest rank here at Georgetown, at the School of Foreign Service in the Department of Government. He's written, as I said in the invite, many books on Korea. You will have surely seen him and his commentary over the last several days, if not much longer, on Korea and Asia in general. He is a trusted source for so many in trying to understand what's happening in Korea and across Asia, and he's been deeply engaged in this particular moment in trying to understand what's happening in Korea. So the format of this chat, it's a half hour designed precisely for a quick dive into current events. And I am going to start with a few questions, and then I am going to open it up to questions that come in written through the Q&A function and try to weave those into the conversation with Victor. So Victor, welcome. It's great to have you. So look, I want to start with a very, very simple question. What's going on in Korea? I mean, this was a shock to everyone. I'm sure a shock to you as well. Just give us a baseline of explain what happened and how do we get to this moment?
Sure. Happy to, Dean Hellman. So I think the thing that caught everybody by surprise was the decision on December 3rd to declare martial law by the president of South Korea, something we have not seen really since the days of military dictatorships in Korea back in the late 1970s, early 1980s. But the origins of this go back to the National Assembly elections, or the midterm elections that were held in Korea last spring, in which the opposition party soundly defeated the ruling party, President Yoon's party, after which there has been deadlock in the legislature. They've not allowed the president to implement or pass any bills. And as we got towards the end of the year, they were blocking the budget that he wanted to get passed. And it created a lot of ill will between the two sides. On top of that, there's a big political knife fight inside of South Korea between the opposition party going after the president's wife for insider trading and other issues, and then the government going after the leader of the opposition party for real estate fraud and some other sorts of issues. So all of this mixed together created a powder keg of politics, and it finally ignited on December 3rd when the president declared martial law, which was then eventually overturned by the National Assembly, the National Legislature, after which he then removed martial law. And then we had an impeachment vote last Saturday, which has failed. So that's kind of where things are now.
So tell us a little bit about the president and the president's decision. You put this in terms of structural politics between the opposition and the president. There are some indications of the president's own sort of stability and clarity of decision making, and obviously some personal concerns that he's had about the potential corruption allegations against his wife. To what extent is this also a story of some worrying signs of instability at the leadership level in Korea?
So I'm sure he's under a tremendous amount of pressure. So Yoon Suk-yeol, the president of South Korea, is for the first time the first South Korean president that is not a career politician. He spent his entire life in the legal world. He was a prosecutor. He actually prosecuted the last president to be impeached in South Korea, President Park Geun-hye. So he came to this job without any experience on foreign policy, really any experience on politics. And it kind of showed both in a good and a bad way during his first 2.5 years as president. It showed in a good way in the sense that he was willing to break many of the sort of traditional foreign policy taboos in terms of really pressing the edges of cooperation for Korea when it came to places like Japan, when it came to being tougher on China, when it came to actually supporting Ukraine's defense against Russia, and going into things like semiconductor supply chains and these other things with the United States. So those are all the good things. But at the same time, he ruled in a way that was really not the way politicians think about politics, which is he didn't sort of have a weather vane up for what was going on in terms of his policy. And he just was kind of like a bull in a china shop. He just went forward. So for this reason, his popularity ratings were always very low. Now they're below 20%, but they were hovering between 20 and 30% throughout his whole time in office. And we have to remember that in Korea, there's a single 5-year term as president, a single 5-year term, which means that structurally, once you pass a midterm election or once you pass the 2.5-year mark, they are effectively lame ducks and very unpopular. Every South Korean president has been that. In addition to that, if you think about it, 1/3 of the South Korean electorate each identify as conservative and progressive. And so we're talking about a conservative government in power right now. And then the remaining third either identify as non-identified or moderate, which again means that every president who comes in has way less than 50% of the vote, and that makes them politically vulnerable. So you combine all of that with the harsh politics, like the knife fight that is Korean politics. It makes our politics here in the United States look tame by comparison. That's a lot of pressure on one person. And so I think he's in a very difficult situation, and it's not clear. It's not clear how well he's thinking with a clear head.
And is the current situation now with the impeachment motions failing, but clearly a very, very strong view of the impulsiveness of the decision, a clear recognition that the decision was mistaken and pulled. Is it tenable to kind of consider going forward with the Yoon regime in this circumstance?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. I think he's basically done. And the question is just how he will leave office. Will he be impeached or will he resign? I think that's sort of where we are now. The impeachment vote failed this past Saturday because they don't have enough votes in the opposition to do it. They need some ruling party defectors, and the ruling party has circled the wagons because they're basically trying to deliver resignation to the Korean people, not impeachment. For the ruling party, if they join the impeachment, they lose. If they are able to deliver President Yoon's resignation, they have more control over the situation, and arguably they win. I say arguably because I think that's their strategy. I don't know if it's going to work, but that's their strategy. So what this means is in the coming weeks, we will see much more protests in Korea. They've already started over the weekend, like big protests. And it looks like the opposition party is going to go for another impeachment vote sometime this coming weekend. And so we'll go through this cycle one more time again. Political instability in Korea, it's not good. It's not good with regard to North Korea. It's not good for the United States, the ally, because Korea is actually important to a lot of the Biden administration's policies in the Indo-Pacific, but that's kind of where we are now.
Now, just to talk about where we are at the moment, because we have this very unusual situation where the president has ceded his constitutional powers, but he's yet still in place. In fact, there's already been a question about his control over foreign policy, obviously, which is critical to us. This seems to be an unconstitutional moment. So tell us a little bit about what this particular moment means.
Right. So the constitutional process, I mean, what we will see, and we've seen it happen once before in Korea, is that the president would be impeached. The prime minister would be acting president, and then there would be a 60-day period for an extraordinary election to elect the next president of South Korea. We've been through this once before after the impeachment of President Park Geun-hye. But as I said, I think because of the politics surrounding this right now, and because the ruling party does have the ability to stop an impeachment vote, we are now in this very bizarre situation where the president has said he will cede decision-making to the party. The party has said that the president's powers are effectively suspended, and the party, the head of the party and the prime minister will work together to administer the affairs of state. There is nothing in the Constitution that allows for this particular configuration, but it is the configuration that has emerged because the ruling party, which has been dealt a very bad hand because of what their president did, is basically trying to salvage something out of this situation, trying to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Like I don't know if it'll work, but I think that's what they're trying to do now, and that's why we're in this very bizarre situation up until the next impeachment vote, which people say is going to happen on Saturday.
Okay, well, one of the things you mentioned in the run up to the conversation was the U.S. position and U.S. engagement with President Yoon has been largely positive, that he's been taking some tough decisions that the U.S. wanted to see, and the U.S. generally had, good relations. Tell us, first of all, how the U.S. has reacted to this, given the concerns they would have about the downfall of this government. And in particular, and there's already a question that's coming from one of the chat participants, what will this mean if he is impeached? Do we start to see a significant structural shift in the kinds of policies that the opposition would put into play, and to some extent, given a little bit more strength, if you will, by the weird circumstances by which it came through? What does it mean for the U.S.?
So the U.S. role, so again, as many of the listeners know, the United States has always played an outside presence in Korea, Korean politics, Korean foreign policy, the key ally of South Korea, provided the security environment in which Korea could grow to the kind of country that it is today, 13th largest economy in the world. And for that exact reason, the United States treads very lightly whenever there is some sort of domestic political crisis in Korea. And so, true to form, the Biden administration, and I think rightly so, basically did not intervene. Obviously, wanted to know what was going on, and it's not clear how much information they had. They clearly didn't have any advance information of the martial law decree, but they've tried to sort of stay on the side, neither of the opposition or the ruling party or President Yoon, but tried to stay on the side of democracy, saying that they wanted any political disputes resolved peacefully in a law-like fashion and according to constitutional processes, which I think is the right place for the United States to be. If the situation gets worse, that position may change, but that's kind of where it is now. In terms of what this means for the United States, I mean, Korea under Yoon, even though it may not have been as popular at home, really has played a very important role in terms of Biden's Indo-Pacific, not just Indo-Pacific policies, but foreign policy. If we look at almost any issue, things like economic security, supply chains, and semiconductors, Korea has been a very important part of that CHIPS 4 alliance that the Biden mission has created. Under Yoon, we've seen tens of billions of dollars of South Korean investment in Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, Arizona, I think Arizona, and other places with regard to both electric vehicle batteries as well as semiconductors. The Yoon government has worked very hard to improve relations with Japan and the trilateral relations that some of you may remember the Camp David summit between the three leaders last August. On nuclear deterrence, again, they've created new structures in the alliance. And Yoon has actually been one of the forthright and more open supporters of Zelensky in Ukraine. I mean, they have provided a great deal of humanitarian and economic support. There are many Ukrainians that are in South Korea today working on getting South Korean investment in Ukraine as soon as any sort of resolution to hostilities is reached. And then South Korea has also been providing indirectly ammunition to Ukraine by basically backfilling Poland, the US Army, and others. And so these are all things where Korea has played an important role. A politically neutered or unstable Korea does not bode well for the United States in all of these areas. And in addition to that, if there's an election in Korea and we have a different president, there's no guarantee that he's going to pursue, or he or she would pursue, any of these same policies. And in fact, if it's a progressive government, there's a good chance that they will not pursue a good many of these policies. Of course, if the Trump administration is still interested in continuing them as well. So there are a lot of moving pieces here.
Well, speaking of moving pieces, there have been two questions regarding what this means for relations with North Korea and how North Korea is looking at this, and another question about China and how China is looking at this and how it might sort of shift some of the dynamics of power within Asia. Can you talk first about North Korea and then about China?
Well, having this sort of political instability in the South is not a very good thing when North Korea's, threats are growing. Their nuclear Their missile threats are really growing unabated. In addition to this, they're a huge supplier of ammunition to the war in Ukraine. And as everybody has seen on the news, they've given 10 to 11,000 troops. The defense chief for Russia was just in North Korea I think it was last week or a little over a week ago. And many people believe that one of the reasons he was there was to ask for more troops to fight in Kursk, as everybody is trying to push the line, during the transition before the new administration comes in, and Trump tries to, if he does try to negotiate a deal. So I don't think the North Koreans are going to do anything security-wise on the Korean Peninsula. If anything, they're enjoying this political crisis in South Korea, and we'll watch it unfold. If they were to intervene in any way, it would have the effect of actually uniting everybody, which is the last thing that the North Koreans want at this point. So I think most of their mischief will continue in Europe, where they're playing this outsized role in the war now. I was just in Brussels, as you know, last week, Joel, and half the conversation was about what the North Koreans are doing in Europe these days.
And how about China?
And with regard to China, the Yun government had, a very strong stance with regard to China. They broke all new precedents for a South Korean president in terms of statements with regard to defense of democracy in Taiwan, maintaining of the status quo, the importance of sea lanes of communication, freedom of navigation, all of these directed at China's coercive activities in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and across the Taiwan Strait. So that could change also dramatically if we have a new president in Korea that is from the other side of the political spectrum, where they've been less willing to be as critical of China, in part because they focus on engagement with China to try to make progress with North Korea in terms of inter-Korean engagement.
So look, this has got to worry the U.S. The combination of all these things that you mentioned in the last sort of answers to several questions. Look, this could mean a change of power in the Korean government, which could have a very different approach to an understanding of U.S.-Korean relations. Obviously, it's emboldening North Korea in a way that is deeply concerning to our European allies, and obviously China also gains from this. And we got a new administration coming. You may have some sense of what the new administration is thinking about Korea. How do you think the U.S. responds to this very, very fluid situation and tries to kind of bring some degree of, I'm not going to say order to the chaos, but I am worried in the new administration and how they strategically engage in such a fluid situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the situation was already fluid when you had basically 4 years of no negotiation with North Korea over their nuclear weapons program, and it has grown by leaps and bounds. And then this new relationship with Russia, where Russia has provided a security guarantee. They provided tons of food and fuel to North Korea, and many people believe high-end military technology to help them with nuclear propulsion submarines and ICBMs. Just that alone would be a difficult situation for the Trump administration to deal with. That on top of this political instability in South Korea, and questions about South Korean participation in supply chains and in the trilateral with Japan. Like this is a lot, right? This is a lot of uncertainty, as your question suggests. I mean, I think for the Biden administration, that all they can do now is sort of watch how the politics plays out in South Korea. By the time they actually elect a new president, if they do, this will certainly be after the Biden administration leaves office. So I don't know how much more they can do at this point. With the Trump administration, you have all of this uncertainty, as I just described, and then you have to put that together with what I think is a very, very radical America First agenda that the Trump administration is going to execute with regard to allies and partners in Europe and in Asia. And when it comes to Korea, the two things to particularly take note of is this cost-sharing agreement or host nation support, where Trump has asked for $10 billion from South Korea as opposed to $1.18 billion. And then the fact that Korea has a $51 million trade surplus with the United States, which Trump is almost certainly going to put tariffs on. So you have that aspect of the relationship, the economic aspect becoming, a little bit more scratchy. And then, there is the concern that Trump will eventually want to pull troops from the Korean Peninsula, because he has always believed that rich countries like Germany and South Korea do not need to have U.S. troops there. They should be managing them their security on their own. So that is a lot of stuff to throw into the hopper. I all I can say is I feel sorry for the next Korea guy on the NSC because it's not going to be an easy job, and it's not going to be me.
That's a shame. But do you have a sense? I mean, we've heard a lot about Rubio, we've heard a lot about Waltz and their views on China. The names that have been floated so far for potential appointments, what can you tell us about their views on Korea, other than the broader view that you mentioned on tariffs and surpluses?
So I think people like Rubio and Waltz are very much sort of they'll sort of have a traditional view of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. alliances. They'll see them as things that are power assets for the United States and relationships that are important for deterrence and stability in the region, deterrence against North Korea, deterrence against China. And so I think on that side of the aisle, things look good. The other appointments, the more controversial ones that we've already seen, Hegseth and Gabbard and some of these others, it's not clear. Like, it's not clear to me what sort of position they'll take. Almost certainly they'll be 100% loyal to President Trump. And if Trump wants to do things like reduce troops in Korea or reduce troops in Germany, I think they will faithfully execute the policy. So, but we really don't know. We really don't know at this point. I do know, however, because we've collected the data on this, Donald Trump has felt there should not be troops on the Korean Peninsula. It's something he's felt long before he became president. We scraped the data on this, and it goes back to the late 1980s, early 1990s that he's been saying this. So he wasn't able to do it in his first term, but it wouldn't surprise me if coming out of the gates he tried to do it in his second term.
And do you think also continue this fascination, as one person put it in the chat, with North Korea and North Korea's leader? Do you think that will continue, especially after North Korean participation in the Ukraine situation?
Yeah, it's so bizarre because you have to throw out all sort of the traditional templates when you think about these sorts of issues. And as your question suggests, it would make no sense for him, given all that the North Koreans have been doing to help Russia and killing innocent Europeans in the middle of Europe. Then again, like Trump has this relationship with Kim Jong-un. Apparently, they've been maintaining contact even while he's been out of office. And so it wouldn't surprise me if he wanted to re-engage with the North Korean leader, not particularly to solve problems, like get them to denuclearize or get them to stop sending troops to Russia, these sorts of things, but just to have the television spectacle of that meeting and aim at trying to at least get the North Korean leader. If there was one thing I think he'd want to get the North Korean leader to stop, that would be ICBM development, intercontinental ballistic missile development, so that it wouldn't be threatening to the homeland of the United States. And I think then he would declare victory at that point. Nobody else would see that as comforting, particularly Japan or South Korea, because of all of North Korea's short and medium range ballistic missiles. But it's entirely, to answer the question, it's entirely possible that he would want to re-engage with Kim, but exactly for what purpose is not entirely clear. And or it could be for the purpose of half deals or fake deals, peace deals that get him the Nobel Peace Prize, but that don't really solve the problem on the Korean Peninsula.
Well, look, as we come to the last few minutes of our half hour together, and there's so much we could still cover, but I want you to talk a little bit more broadly about what this situation and what we may see over the next couple of weeks means for Korean democracy. Is this a case in which Korean democracy has shown its resilience by the quick response? Or if we're likely to see over the coming weeks continued, perhaps multiple impeachment efforts that may fail or may succeed. We're seeing the possibility of large-scale protests. What does it say about the level of engagement in South Korea's democracy and the future for South Korea's democracy?
Yeah. So we should start by saying the context of this is South Korea is an example of one of the most peaceful transitions to democracy in human history. I mean, when we compare it to other democracy movements, very little death, right? To be very crude about it. In 1987, where the public basically won over the government where they demanded direct presidential elections. So So, I'm on the board of the National Endowment for Democracies. I participated in some of the Democracy Summit preparation stuff where you had Southeast Asian countries that were saying, like to Korea, they were saying Korea needs to step up and talk about democracy because your democracy was homegrown. And I've seen Japanese people in that same meeting saying also Korea needs to step up on democracy because theirs is homegrown. And they would say, like in Japan's case, our democracy was given to us. It was assigned to us by the United States. But South Korea is a much more credible case. That democracy has been resilient for the most part. As I mentioned before, there was an impeachment in the past of the South Korean president in which they followed the Constitution and they did a 60-day period. They had an election, they elected a new president. And so it was a crisis, but at the same time, they showed the institution was resilient. The South Korean president, the current South Korean president, won by a razor thin margin, won a direct popular vote in South Korea, won by a razor thin margin, and nobody protested the election, nobody stormed the Capitol, right? Nobody said the voting machines were not working. The leader of the opposition called the winning candidate, congratulated them, and it was a transition, orderly transition. And so in this case, one hopes that that's how things will play out. But if he is impeached, they'll have they'll have an acting prime minister. I mean, prime minister as acting president, and for 60 days they'll have a camp period, and they'll elect the new president. If that does not happen, if this fails in some way, it would be a real blow to one of the most resilient democracies in Asia. The thing about Korea, people always say it's a raucous democracy. It's rough and tumble and raucous, but it's resilient. And so this, in many ways, is the biggest test of democracy that we've seen in Korea since the democracy protests in the spring of 1987.
So, Victor, we've got, I'm sure, many investors on the call, and there have been questions about how the private sector is reacting. We see a sell-off of the won. Is this just a largely a knee-jerk reaction to a kind of stunning set of political events? Or, you're suggesting there's kind of considerable uncertainty over the medium term, and there may be other structural components that are explaining some of the won sell-off, or perhaps some of the concerns in the investor community. And we'll leave it at that as a final question.
So when I've talked to investors, institutional investors, and then hedge fund folks over this, this is not my area, but my sense is that they all have already priced in North Korea risk. So North Korea risk is already priced in to some extent, and even if they do a nuclear test, risk is kind of priced in. We actually did a study on this a few years ago where we looked at the impact of North Korean tests on the Kospi, on the Nikkei, and on the Dow Jones, and the impact was actually negligible, right? It didn't have, there might have been a small dip, but it was negligible in the long term. But when we're talking about two other things, this question of where the democracy is going to break down in Korea, and then secondly, the question of whether the United States is going to take a fundamentally different position on Korea when Trump comes into office. These are things that I do not think are priced into Korea risk. And so, yes, I mean, I would be concerned about like the Kospi. I would be concerned about capital outflows, selling off of the won if this crisis continues, or if Trump comes in January 20th and talks about starting to reduce troops on the Korean Peninsula. These are things, again, that I don't think investors are used to seeing in Korea. They're used to seeing North Korean activity. They're used to seeing it all the time, but they're not used to seeing either of these two things. And so that would make for a much more precarious environment.
Well, let's end on that note. Look, we couldn't be luckier to have Victor Cha in our community at such a remarkable time in Korean politics and U.S.-Korea relations. I want to thank you for taking the time. And I know you've been very, very busy, deeply engaged in the media concerns about this. And I know you've been relied upon for your advice at the highest levels of government. So I want to appreciate you taking time to engage with SFS alumni on this. And I want to we got through most of the questions that were put through on the chat and the Q&A. So I really appreciate those who put out questions. And when we say one final thing, which is that we meant these fast break things to be very occasional when something really significant happens. It just seems that we have a lot of these significant events happening. So keep an eye out. We're going to try to do some similar fast break event on Syria even sometime this week if we can. But thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you very much, Victor, for spending time with us. And I look forward to seeing you again for another Fast Break in the near future. Take care, everyone.